After recently returning to the Long Dark for the first time in over a year, I decided to attempt to get the Broken Body achievement, which requires you to survive long enough in misery difficulty for all of the afflictions to set in. This takes 46 in-game days, and I made a video recently about my first run attempting to get this achievement. Suffice it to say, that attempt was unsuccessful, but I was determined not to give up that easily. Following the run from the previous video, I did a couple more attempts that all ended fairly early, either because something went terribly wrong within the first few days, or I just didn't get the start that I wanted and decided to just reset. But after a few bad attempts, I began this run, which had real potential to be the run that made it all the way to the 47th day. My basic plan for this run was the same as the last, which was to loot the barn first, then loop around the river towards Thompson's Crossing. I would then spend the night there and make my way towards Mystery Lake early on the morning of day 2. This run I found some great loot in the barn, including a flare, the heavy hammer, and an emergency stim. I grabbed some cattails on the way to Thompson's Crossing, and on the edge of the town I found a pry bar. While searching the town, I didn't find any good jackets this time, but I did at least get some wool socks and some mittens. I also found a decent amount of snacks around the town. After grabbing any useful items, I went to sleep and ended day 1. Early on day 2, I began the trek towards the cave that brings you to the dam and eventually to Mystery Lake. I was able to make it to the cave without too much condition loss from the cold. Within the cave, I found a deer carcass to harvest, an easy deer pelt, and a few guts to grab without having to harvest out in the cold. I was also able to grab a couple of rabbits on the other side of the cave. After that, I started making my way up towards the Hydro Dam, where unfortunately I found little of note this time, so I made my way straight through the dam to the trailers on the other side. Once in the trailer, I spent the rest of the afternoon harvesting the rabbits I picked up earlier, and then slept through the night until day 3. The next morning, I quickly looted the other trailer, and then started making my way down the railroad tracks. As I stopped to harvest a nearby deer carcass, a wolf approached me. Thankfully, my fire was able to keep him at bay, so I went on harvesting the deer. Once I was done with the deer, I threw a torch at the wolf to scare it off, and started making my way following the river, as to stay away from the path that the wolf had gone down. After looping around for a while, I made my way back towards the train, and found yet another deer carcass. As I still had a burning torch, I decided to start another fire and try and harvest that deer as well. With this third deer hide, I would be able to craft the deerskin pants once the 3 hides had cured. With all those hides and guts in hand, I made my way to the camp office where I stayed the night. Early on the morning of day 4, while I was waiting for the sun to come out, I started looting the camp office and found myself some decent trail boots, but not much else of note. So once the sun came out and the weather was clear, I started making my way towards the trapper's cabin, making sure to grab as much birch bark as I could find along the way. I also took out 2 rabbits near the trapper's cabin before making my way inside. I was able to find some pretty decent loot inside the trapper's cabin, most notably the storm lantern and a hacksaw. I harvested the rabbits I just caught and cooked them up for dinner before going to sleep and ending day 4. As soon as weather permitted, I left on the morning of day 5 to head towards the Forlorn Muskeg region in order to use the forge at the Old Spence family homestead. Once getting to Forlorn Muskeg, I followed the train tracks down to the poacher's camp, where I found some coal, a wool scarf, and a few other useful items. I then started making my way across the frozen wastes of Forlorn Muskeg, eventually reaching the Old Spence family homestead, where I found a ski jacket, as well as a decent bit more coal for the forge. After starting a fire in the forge, I immediately went and crafted the improvised knife. After the knife was completed, I went to sleep by the warmth of the forge. Early on day 6, I crafted the improvised hatchet, and then used the rest of my remaining scrap metal to make as many arrowheads as I could. By the late afternoon, the weather was looking pretty good, so I loaded up on some warm coffee and started making the trek back to Mystery Lake. This time, I left a decent amount of fuel behind for another forge trip in the future. Before long, I was able to make it back to the Mystery Lake region, and was even able to grab some birch and maple saplings on my way back in. However, I probably should have waited to find the saplings, as I could tell there was a fog setting in. And before I could make it back to a safe house, I nearly ran into a wolf because of the fog. Not wanting to take any risks, I used a flare to keep the wolf away from me as I made my way to the nearby cabin. Thankfully, I already knew which direction I needed to be heading in, so I was able to make my way to the cabin safely, despite the low visibility. On day 7, the first random affliction of misery mode hit me, sour stomach, which reduces the total number of calories you can store and makes food poisoning more likely. Though inconvenient, this is likely the easiest of the afflictions that you have during misery mode, so I'm glad to have gotten this one to roll first. The only other thing I really did on day 7 was head back to the trapper's cabin and lay everything out to cure. Early on the morning of day 8, I set out towards the nearby cave to make my way to the mountain town region. My plan was to stay in this region for a bit, grabbing all of the plentiful loot from the town of Milton, while I wait for various items to cure back in the trapper's cabin. After making my way down into the valley, I went to the nearby cave, where I found another box of matches, started a fire, and hung out there until it was daylight. Once it was sunny and a bit warmer, I headed out of the cave and climbed up the other side of the valley. Up at the top, I quickly looted the small office there that had a couple of helpful items, most notably a wool toque. I then went on to the Orca gas station, where I found lots of good snacks, and then went on to loot the houses in the town of Milton one by one. At the credit union, I found lots of coffee, some new work boots, and an insulated flask. I then made my way to the main Milton safe house, which usually has the best loot. I found a decent amount of food, books, and other helpful items there, like matches. But most importantly, I found the combat pants and the magnifying lens upstairs. After all that looting, I went to sleep and ended day 8. I spent day 9 grabbing any of the remaining loot that I wasn't able to grab the day before, and then researching through the rest of the day, until it was eventually time to go to sleep. On day 10, I set out for the return journey back to Mystery Lake. The weather was relatively mild, with no major storms or fog, and I was able to make it all the way back without encountering any hostile wildlife either. All the coffee that I found while I was in Milton definitely helped with the climbing, as it allowed me to climb while draining much less fatigue. Once I was back in Mystery Lake and had dropped off some items at the trapper's cabin, I started making my way towards the camp office. A heavy fog had rolled in, but thankfully by that point I was able to simply follow the power lines all the way there. Inside, I was able to collect all the various pelts and guts that I had harvested during the first 3 days, which I stashed here at the camp office my first night in Mystery Lake. And then I would finally be able to begin crafting the deerskin pants. After working on the pants for a few hours, I went to sleep and ended day 10. I spent all of day 11 hanging out at the camp office, boiling water and working on the deerskin pants until they were eventually done. With these and the combat pants that I found in Milton, I was beginning to feel pretty good about my overall clothing. On day 12, I set out to loot the fishing huts and other cabins surrounding Mystery Lake. In one of the fishing huts, I found a flare, which would come in handy shortly after, as while I was out exploring, I got cornered and followed by a wolf into the nearby cave. Honestly, I couldn't remember if wolves would follow you into caves, so I held the flare out just in case. As soon as the wolf entered the fringe of the cave, I popped the flare, because I didn't want to take any risks. After using the flare to scare off the wolf, I started a fire and decided to hang out in this cave for a while I read some books. I ended up spending the night in the cave, sleeping only a few hours at a time to ensure that I didn't accidentally freeze to death. On day 13, I set out to loot the rest of the ice fishing huts and cabins surrounding the lake. Once I got back to the camp office, I started crafting some fishing hooks and a simple fishing lure so that I could go fishing the next day.
Not sure why I feel so tired.
On day 14, I made my way to the fishing hut closest to the camp office, where I had stashed a bunch of reclaimed wood, and got ready for a long day of fishing. My goal with the fishing trip was, of course, to catch fish, but on top of that, I also just wanted to spend some more time outside so that I wouldn't have to deal with cabin fever again for a while. I had enough fuel for the potbelly stove stashed in the ice fishing hut that I was able to fish solid through the rest of day 14, through the night, and even all throughout day 15. In total, I was able to catch at least 13 fish, some of them even being larger bass. By the evening of day 15, I had loads of fish but no more fuel, so I started waddling my way back to the camp office. With the smell of all that fish, I did attract the attention of a wolf, but thankfully I was able to make it back to the camp office without any real trouble. I spent all of day 16 hanging out at the camp office researching books and boiling water, as the weather wasn't really permissive of doing anything else outside that day. On day 17, I made my way back towards the trapper's cabin, where I knew my saplings would be fully cured by this point. Once I was back at the cabin, I immediately started crafting arrow shafts, arrows, and the survival bow. While I was in the process of crafting, I also got hit with the next random affliction, rheumatic joints. This affliction makes sprains more likely and makes it so that you cannot hold back the arrow of your bow for as long, making it rather ironic to get this affliction as I was crafting the bow for the first time. While I had hoped to do some bow hunting before rheumatic joints set in, I'm still glad that it wasn't any of the other two afflictions that are even more difficult.
Just lay down right here.
I began day 18 by doing a little rabbit hunting around the trapper's cabin, but while I was wandering around looking for other animals to hunt with my new bow, I found pretty much nothing, so went back and slept on day 18 unsuccessful. On day 19, I decided to head back to the camp office area, where I would continue to fish until my last fishing line broke, and then try and find some hunting in that area instead. After having spent the rest of the day fishing, I went back to the camp office to cook up those fish, and then went to sleep, ending day 19. On day 20, I searched the area around the camp office, and then eventually started strolling back towards the trapper's cabin, but still was unsuccessful in finding any deer to hunt. I did, however, find a bear near the cabin that I lured towards me with a rock and got a shot on. As the bear was running towards me, I ran in the cabin for a bit before heading back outside to get another shot on the bear. Unfortunately, this time I missed and the bear ran off. On day 21, I set out to find the bear that I had shot the day before, hoping to find it bled out somewhere. After searching around for a bit, I was unable to find the bear, but I did hunt a couple of rabbits near the unnamed pond. As I continued on, I also found a deer carcass I decided to try and harvest, since I was having so much trouble finding any deer actually still alive. After harvesting the deer, I made my way towards the clear cut, where I saw a bear on the ground that I thought could be the bear that I shot the day before. But as I approached him, I realized that bear was not dead at all, but just taking a nap. As I continued down the road, though, I was finally able to find and get a shot on a deer. After tracking him for a little while, I found him bled out close to the nearby logging camp.
All right.
I was able to spend the rest of the evening harvesting the deer and cooking as much of the venison as I could, before I hobbled back to the nearby trailer to sleep the night. With all this venison, I planned to hunker down at the logging camp for a few days, while I gained my strength and got the well-fed bonus. I spent the next 2 days hanging out at the logging camp, eating up the venison, boiling water, and reading research books. I spent much of the 2 days at the outdoor fire stove as to help stave off cabin fever. On day 24, I finally left the logging camp, with overmax condition because of the well-fed bonus. As I was beginning to make my way back to the trapper's cabin, I came across a deer that I stopped to hunt. While I was able to hit this deer, I had a lot more trouble tracking him as he ran up through the hills, and because of my rheumatic joints, I got multiple sprains attempting to track him down, and eventually had to just give up on him. Eventually, I was able to safely return to the cabin, but the wolf followed me all the way back. After dropping off some pelts and guts to cure at that cabin, I left and began to make my way back to my main base, the trapper's cabin. Along the way, I got yet another sprain, but didn't have time to stop and heal it because I was also being followed by a wolf. Once I was safely back home, I began working on the rabbit skin mitts, and then went to sleep, ending day 24. On day 25, I finished crafting the rabbit skin mitts, and then made my way outside, where I hunted a few more rabbits. After that, I went out searching for deer again, and although it took a little while, I eventually found a grove with multiple deer in it. After patiently waiting for the right shot, I was able to take the deer out instantly with one arrow, without having to wait for it to bleed out. Unfortunately, although I was able to kill the deer before I started starving, I was not able to cook and eat any of the venison before losing my well-fed bonus. While I was still trying to finish harvesting the deer, a strong wind came through to blow out my fire, making it too cold, forcing me to abandon him and make my way back to the camp office. Unsurprisingly, since I was carrying quite a bit of venison, I was also followed all the way home by a wolf. Thankfully, I was able to give him the runaround with this hill and make it safely back to the entrance of the camp office. Once I was there, I went to sleep and ended day 25. On the morning of day 26, I started up a fire outside to cook up the rest of the venison that I had harvested from the day before. While I was cooking, a fog rolled in, so I waited a few hours inside, and then in the afternoon, when the weather was looking pretty good, I decided to head out exploring. I ultimately ended up making my way to the forestry lookout, which turned out to be a pretty big waste of time because there wasn't really anything useful up there. After collecting the small bits of loot that was up there, I started making my way back down the mountain and eventually headed towards the trapper's cabin. Outside of the trapper's cabin, I found a moose, which I considered taking shots at, but I ultimately decided not to bother, as I only had 2 arrows and was unlikely to kill the moose with just the 2, as moose do not bleed out. On day 27, I started making my way towards the cabin on the other side of the unnamed pond, in order to collect all of the cured guts and pelts that I had left there. After collecting all of those pelts and guts, I made my way back to the camp office, where I crafted the rabbit skin hat and started work on the deerskin boots. I then slept through the night and ended day 27. Early on the morning of day 28, I decided to set off to leave Mystery Lake for good and return to Pleasant Valley, the region in which this run began. My plan was to hole up at the Pleasant Valley homestead, which has a 6-burner stove, tons of wood from all the furniture within the building and in its basement, and more plentiful wildlife than Mystery Lake. It wasn't that I had completely run Mystery Lake dry, but the abundance of resources and reclaimed wood was definitely a lot less than it was when I first came there. And I knew that besides the town of Thompson's Crossing, Pleasant Valley was practically an untouched region, which would have more than enough resources to survive through day 46. The journey through the dam and down the winding river back to Pleasant Valley wasn't too bad, But the whole time I was running low on calories, and unfortunately wasn't able to find and eat any more food before I lost my well-fed bonus once again. In hindsight, I would have been better off ignoring the well-fed bonus and conserving my food using starvation tactics like I did at the beginning of the run. I was trying to keep my well-fed bonus because normally at this point in an interloper run, I would have enough food to consistently stay well-fed and keep that condition and carry weight bonus. The problem on misery difficulty isn't that there is less food or less animals, but that it's more difficult to obtain the food because the temperatures are even colder, and the weather even more inconsistent, making hunting and harvesting animals much more difficult compared to interloper. The need for that carry weight bonus is even greater on misery difficulty, as you have 10 kilograms less base carrying capacity compared to interloper. But even with that hit to carrying capacity, I would recommend conserving your food and only eating it before sleep, even through the middle game. Unless you are in the late game and have some massive stockpile of food, I really don't think that it's worth trying to stay well fed. After 2 days of traveling and looting the Pleasant Valley homestead upon my arrival, I went to sleep, ending day 29. I began day 30 reclaiming some wood and then went outside to find a deer just beyond the porch. After one-shotting the deer, I started to harvest it, but was unfortunately interrupted by a storm blowing in, which forced me to go back inside and wait for the wind to let up before I could finish harvesting the deer. After warming up inside and getting a hot drink, I went out to chop up the rest of the deer with my hatchet. After that was done, I spent the rest of the afternoon working on the deerskin boots before going to sleep. On the morning of day 31, I crafted some snares and finally finished the deerskin boots. After I was done crafting, I fired up the stove to cook all the venison and then dropped it off outside to stay fresh. I then went to go set up my snares and then came back to the house to sleep and end day 31. On day 32, while I was researching archery, I got hit with the final 2 afflictions prior to Broken Body: Frigid Bones and Haunted Mind. Frigid Bones simply makes it so that you are colder and it takes longer to warm back up, and Haunted Mind means you can only sleep 7 hours at a time, and your condition gain from sleeping is reduced by 50%. These are the hardest 2 afflictions in my opinion, so while it's beneficial that I got them last, it also meant a huge spike of difficulty for the final days here. On day 33, after realizing I had caught nothing with my snares so far, I decided to move them to another location. But to be honest, I don't really know how the snares work, because I rarely use them. I spent most of the rest of the afternoon harvesting this frozen deer carcass before returning home and sleeping for the night, ending day 33. I began day 34 by breaking down some furniture around the house for the reclaimed wood, and then left the house to go hunting again. After wandering around for way too long, I finally found this deer that I was able to hit with an arrow and track down until I was able to harvest him. But the whole thing took so long, and my condition loss was happening even faster because of the Frigid Bones affliction. By the time I was even done harvesting this deer, I was uncomfortably low on condition and was very worried for the trip back. To make things even worse, the wind started picking up and it got even colder. My condition and fatigue were so low that I decided to pop an emergency stim to help me get back to the house in time. I most likely could have made it without popping the emergency stim, but didn't want to risk the weather getting even worse as I hobbled back. On day 35, I headed down to the little barn to check on my snares, where I was approached by a bear. I used my proximity to the barn as an advantage, where I got a shot off on the bear, and then ran around the barn to the door on the other side, planning to hide in there while I warmed up and waited for the bear to bleed out. Unfortunately, after leaving the barn, the bear was nowhere to be found, and I never ended up finding his carcass. I was, however, able to find and hunt another deer. Not quite getting the one shot, but still being able to track him down and harvest him not too far away. But once again, by the time I was able to track him down, I was quite low on condition again. Thankfully, this deer bled out much closer to home, so I was able to return and sleep through the night much easier than the last time. I spent all of day 36 at the homestead, cooking all the venison and boiling a bunch of water at this campfire outside. This allowed me to get as much water as I would need for the rest of the run and helped me prevent cabin fever. If I had simply rationed my venison, then I probably would have had enough food to survive the rest of the run. But for some reason, I continued to try and maintain the well-fed bonus. I spent days 37 and 38 at the homestead, mostly just breaking apart furniture for reclaimed wood. On day 39, I set out to do some hunting and also potentially some fishing. I found no deer on my way towards the fishing hut, so I decided to hang out there and start fishing instead. I had a decent amount of reclaimed wood, so I started up the potbelly stove, and also found some herbal tea in this cabinet. I started fishing, hoping to catch even a fraction of what I was able to get in Mystery Lake, but had no such luck. After fishing for the rest of the evening, I slept for a few hours into day 40. Finally, on day 40, I caught a single smallmouth bass, but by that point I was nearly out of fuel, and a blizzard had set in outside. I didn't know how long the storm would last, so I couldn't risk trying to wait it out in the fishing hut, and was forced to leave in the midst of the blizzard. I started running in the direction of the river, hoping to use that as a guide to find my way back to shelter. Once I made it to the lower falls, I knew that I could at least find my way back to the barn, but I didn't know if I would be able to survive that long in this weather. Just as I was coming over the hill towards the barn, the blizzard began to let up, meaning I likely could have just waited it out in the ice fishing hut. But either way, I was just so glad that I didn't throw the run right there at the end just because I wanted to go fishing. After a few-hour nap in the barn while I warmed up, I made it the rest of the way back to the Pleasant Valley farmstead, but I wasn't quite out of the woods yet. Because I had been trying to maintain the well-fed bonus instead of properly rationing my food, I was completely out of my stockpile. I only really had one option for food, which was to attempt to hunt a wolf during the geomagnetic storm. I don't know what this storm actually does to the wolf's AI. Potentially it makes them more aggressive. But either way, I led a wolf right back to the porch and was able to take him out with a single shot. I had been avoiding carnivore meat this whole time, but at this point I realized it doesn't even really matter if I get intestinal parasites. I'll be done with the run before it becomes a serious problem anyways. So I ate a hunk of wolf meat and slept through night 40. On day 41, I went out to look for some deer to hunt, but unfortunately all I found around me were wolves, and because of the fog, I knew I didn't have many other options. So I tried to lure the wolf back to the house so I could do the same thing to this wolf that I did to the other wolf last night. Thankfully, the wolf bled out on top of me just after the struggle began, and I decided there was no way I was going to try and kill any more wolves on this run. Thankfully, the meat from this one should be just about enough to finish it. Not far from the entrance to the farmhouse, I tried to hunt a small deer, as I knew that the meat from this one would be enough to finish the rest of the run for sure. Somehow, this deer survived not just one, or even two, but all three of my remaining arrows, running away looking like a pincushion, giving me no other option than to turn in for the night and hope to find his carcass the next day. On day 42, I set out to find that deer, and finally found his carcass pretty far from where I last saw him, meaning he still probably ran around with 3 arrows in him for multiple in-game hours. I don't know exactly how arrow damage and bleed out times are calculated in this game, but I don't think I've ever needed 3 arrows to kill a deer before. And if I did, it definitely died on the third shot. Either way, thanks to that deer, I knew that I would have enough meat to survive through day 46 if I properly rationed it. And so I spent days 43 through 46 remaining at the homestead. Wanting to sleep through as much of the remaining days as possible, I came up with the strategy of loading myself up on jugs of water and running back and forth within the house to make myself tired very quickly. It was only at that point that I realized this strategy could also be used to regain condition more efficiently after gaining the Haunted Mind affliction. But either way, after a few dozen hours and 3 major attempts, I finally got the Broken Body achievement. And while it's no day 100 survival, I still consider this having sufficiently conquered misery difficulty. And while I could continue the save to see how long I can make it, or simply leave the save alone and never touch it again, neither of those seem as a fitting end to this story. Because the stages of misery you have to face in this difficulty in many ways parallel the real-life stages of grief. And just like in real life, the final stage of overcoming misery or grief is acceptance. And so after a pilgrimage back to Thompson's Crossing, I sat outside by a bench in the nearby cemetery in the midst of the storm, waiting to meet my maker.